Hey everyone, I'd like to share a tip on how I provide stability to 2D plush parts without using wire. A 2D plush part is just a part that has a front and a back and no gussets or any complex shapes. I try not to use wire or armature in my plushies unless my client specifically requests it, but from time to time you'll need to make a part of a plush that has to defy gravity. Examples of this include wings, fins, and tall ears like these rabbit ears here. So my method keeps the object soft while also keeping the object sturdy enough to stand on its own. This ear here does not have anything in it to give it stability despite it being the same exact pattern piece, but you can see the difference in these two pieces, how this one is quite stiff and this one is just very floppy. So before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more plush making content. Let's get started. My technique to get these objects to stand on their own without wire is to use a stiff material like felt or flexible foam as lining inside of the fabric, and my preference is to use a stiff felt. There's a lot of cheap felt out there that'll just fall apart when you use it, so you need to find something medium to high quality. And I just find this at Joann's, and I kind of just go by touch. If I feel it and it feels really thin and like it'll degrade over time, I'll just pick a different type. So you can see this kind here, while it's still felt, so it's not the highest quality material in the world, it's still pretty stiff and it has a nice strength to it when you hold it, and it kind of just stands up on its own. Another material you can use is a soft, flexible foam. You don't want something that's too stiff so it'll snap when you bend it. I want to be able to sew through this material. So something like upholstery foam would not work for this technique. This foam that I bought is the kind that's used in puffy purses, just to give you an idea. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick, and it's soft and flexible, but it's still sturdy. And I'll put a link in the description to where I bought this on Amazon. So it's really just personal preference which you use. They're both effective. I'll say that I just tend to use felt more than the foam, but I do like them both. So we're going to sew this material into the object itself, and that will make it sturdy. And this method will work for small to medium objects. Examples of things that I've used it on are wings for My Little Ponies, fins on a Vaporeon, and just really large ears. I also used it to line Tidbit the Clown Cat's hat here so it would stand up on its own and not flop over. An example of a time when this didn't work was for this giant tail on this raptor plush. The feathers were just way too big for this method, and it wouldn't stand up just using the felt itself, so I did have to resort to using wire. So another caveat is that your piece needs to have a decent sized base, and by base I mean the area where it connects to the head or the part of the plush that you're attaching it to. So this is a test ear that I made for this plush, and you can see that it's still pretty floppy, and that's because the bottom of the ear was just too narrow and didn't have enough strength. So both of these pieces have 2 pieces of felt inside of it. It's just that this ear, which is the final ear, has a wider base. So if I put one on top of the other, you can see how it is a little bit wider. But also I did my 3D ear fold technique on this ear, which also helped add strength to this piece. So we're going to line this 2D plush part with this felt, and in my experience you need to use several layers of this felt, and the number of layers depends on how large your object is, but from my trials for this year only 2 layers was enough. And you need to be able to sew through all the layers of felt and the minky, or if you're using the foam you probably need to use fewer layers since it is thicker than the felt. So here is my ear with the right sides together, and it's ready to be sewn, but I need to cut out the lining first. So I'm going to cut out 2 pieces of felt per ear, and I'm just going to cut them larger than the pattern pieces so I don't have to try and get them exactly aligned. And since I'm making 2 ears, I need to do this twice. So now that it's cut out, I'm going to just take the felt and place it behind my pattern pieces. It needs to be behind your pattern piece, touching one of the wrong sides or the ugly side of the fabric. if it's between your pattern pieces, when you flip it right side out, it's going to show. And I'm not going to pin it to the pattern pieces. It's not necessary since I cut out the felt much larger than the pattern piece, and if you pin several layers of felt to your object, it can distort the object a little bit as you sew it. So since it's cut so much larger, you don't really have to worry about this shifting around too much. And if you are going to sew two symmetrical pieces like ears, you want to flip one of them so it's facing the opposite way when you sew it to the felt. The dimension of this object is going to be slightly different on each side. So you're going to end up having a more flat side on one side than the other side, which is the side that the felt was actually sewn to. So you can see like this subtle curved shape that this object ends up getting. And I actually really like this effect, especially for things like ears, because I feel like it makes it look a little bit more realistic. But if this bothers you, having this slightly different shape, then you could try using it as an insert rather than sewing it directly to the fabric. You could just sew the piece, flip it right side out, and then insert the felt or the foam inside of the piece. But I do think some of the strength comes from sewing it into the actual seam itself. And then you also have to figure out a way to attach the foam or the felt inside of the object so that it won't shift around over time. Paying attention to little things like this, like how the felt is going to make it look slightly different depending on what side you sew it to, are small little touches that'll make your plushies look more professional. So now I'm just going to sew along the seam allowance of my ear pattern with the felt along the back of it. I just use a normal length stitch with no special adjustments. Adding the felt can make it harder to turn the pieces right sides out if you have a very small opening for the object. So if you do have that situation, you might want to try and leave an opening that's larger than you typically would. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew this real quick. So here it's sewn together. Again, I didn't do anything different. I just sewed along my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now that it's sewn, I need to trim away the excess felt, and I also need to clip my curves. So I'm just going to take my sharp pair of scissors and start just by trimming away the excess felt. You don't want it to add too much extra bulk. And then I'm just going to snip my seam allowance, and you want to snip into your seam allowance on objects that have curves because it'll help them look more professional and clean, and it's going to help the curve come out and not have any wrinkles. Okay, so now we just have to flip this right side out, and the felt will go on the inside of the object. Just use a little turner tool to help push out the piece. It'll be a little bit more difficult just because, again, the whole point of it was to make it more stiff. Just gonna run that pointer tool along the seam to make sure that it gets pushed out all the way. Okay. So now we have this ear, and you can see it's nice and stiff. So I did pattern this ear to have 3D folds, and you can check out another one of my tutorials if that's something that interests you, and I will link that. So we're just going to fold this over along the bottom to create those folds. And then I just have to sew along the bottom to keep it in place and sew this into my head, and I can compare the one that I didn't sew any stuffing into, so you can see the difference if I hold it at the bottom, how this back one without anything in it flops down, but this one is nice and sturdy, but it's also super soft and still will move around a little bit but stay up on its own. And the flexibility and softness is definitely something that you wouldn't get with wire. So let's go ahead and finish this up and see how it looks on the plush. And here are the ears sewn onto the head. You can see they're nice and sturdy, but also still very flexible and soft. They can stand on their own completely without any wire, and they look really good. So I can go ahead and get this sewn onto the plush and finish up. Thanks for watching. See you next time.